Hello, everyone. Today's date is November 14th, 2021. We're having a Israeli-Palestinian Confederation event. We're not having a simulation, but a discussion today with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky appeared with us or for us before, and we discussed some issues relating to a common government, and Mr. Chomsky raised some concerns, and we're here to have a discussion with him. So we're not going to have the traditional simulation. We are going to have a discussion. I'm going to present a little bit of what the Confederation stands for, and then we will have a question and answer. I'll ask Mr. Chomsky some questions, and then we'll open it up. So we'll have a very large segments for the participants to ask Mr. Chomsky questions. My name is Joseph Avasar, and this is my email, josephavassar@gmail.com. I would very much appreciate comments after the event. This is our website for the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, and it's in 3 languages. It's ipconfederation.org. If you go to the English portion, it's in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. If you go to the English portion, you could read the Constitution, and you could read the full Constitution, because what we are presenting during the simulation is a very short version or explanation of the Constitution. It's not the actual Constitution. The actual Constitution is on our website. It is available in 3 languages, in English, in Arabic, and Hebrew. And I think that you should read it, especially before you send me comments, because a lot of the comments I get, people, it's clear that they didn't read the Constitution, and they don't really understand what this common government stands for. Today, we have as a guest speaker, Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky teaches analytic philosophy and cognitive science at MIT and the University of Arizona. He's the author of more than 150 books on topics such as linguistics, war, politics, and mass media. He has written substantially on Israel-Palestine and was denied entry to the West Bank by the Israeli authorities. The New York Times Book Review described him as the most widely read voice on foreign policy on the planet. The Guardian described him, Chomsky ranks with Marx, Shakespeare, and the Bible as one of the 10 most quoted sources in the humanities. So, like I said, Mr. Chomsky is now appearing for the 2nd time. He is generous to give us his time to discuss this again, and discuss the idea of a confederation and the Constitution. And we are very, very appreciative, Mr. Chomsky, for your time and your willingness to discuss this. And I think that the audience really want to hear you. And last time, we didn't really have a good opportunity to discuss. And this time, I'm hoping we will discuss. I will be asking you questions, and then the audience will ask you questions. We are also inviting for future simulations, and also in the past, people from all walks of life with all kinds of points of views on the Israel-Palestine issue. We are not limited to one segment of pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinians. We're inviting everyone because we want to have the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation Constitution, and the idea being stress tested by people that are familiar, that are speaking about it, doing research about this matter, and have more knowledge than the average person, or most of us. So on November 30th, we will have Professor Mark Juergensmeyer of UC Santa Barbara. On December 19, we are going to have current Israeli Knesset member. He's now in the Knesset, Ofer Kasif. He'll be on December 19. We are going to have Richard Falk, Professor of International Law, on December 27. We are going to have Gadi Baltyansky, who was the press secretary for Prime Minister Ehud Barak. And I can tell you he was a lot more than that for Ehud Barak. And he was also engaged with a lot of discussion about peace. On January 9, 2022, we're going to have Professor Galia Golan, a political science professor, on January 23rd. Galia Golan is a professor of government at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel. We're going to have Professor Sami Smuha, who on February 20th, Professor Sami Smuha is of Haifa University. He's an expert on Israel and the Middle East and economy and society. We are going to have Professor Shibli Telhami, Professor of Political Science, on March 20th, 22. We're going to have a lot more guests in between and in the next year. I'm going to skip some of what we normally do, but I would like to play this video to explain to the audience and refresh your recollection regarding what is the common confederation.
The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has endured for generations. And instead of time healing the wounds, it's only caused the anger to fester and the violence to grow. But what if there was a way to alleviate the tension? Something that may not outright solve every problem, but at least create a forum that encourages a peaceful compromise. Welcome to the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, a common third government between the Israeli and Palestinian citizens, specifically designed to foster peace, tolerance, and economic prosperity between the two nations. Here's how it works. First off, both Israel and Palestine will keep their respective governments. Israel's Knesset and the Palestinian National Authority will remain unchanged. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation, IPC, will be a third entity acting as a unifying agent between the two. The IPC will comprise 300 parliament members elected from 300 districts in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Above them will preside a president and vice president, one Israeli and one Palestinian. In order for the IPC to pass a law, it will require a 55% majority from its Israeli representatives, as well as a 55% majority from its Palestinian representatives, thereby preventing either side from monopolizing the legislature. Of course, the IPC won't undermine the political power of either the Israeli or the Palestinian government. At any time, Israel or Palestine may veto a law passed by the IPC. If neither side vetoes, the law is passed. And the two nations are another step closer to resolution. Please help us make this a reality. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation. We might speak different languages, but we all mean the same thing.
So normally at this stage, we go into a simulation. We're not going to do it today. We are going to speak to Mr. Chomsky. But I would like to read the Constitution as was amended after we had the meeting with Mr. Chomsky. So let me read it to you, and then we'll go to Mr. Chomsky and ask his opinion regarding what amendments that we made, actually the deletion that we made in the Constitution. We believe that Palestinians and Israelis are entitled to equal rights under the law and guaranteed human rights and freedom. The Israeli-Palestinian Confederation does not intend to supersede or supplant the Palestinian or the Israeli government, nor to abrogate or undermine any agreements between those governments. In other words, we are saying we are a third government for the people that represents the people of Israel and Palestine in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. We have legitimacy because we are elected, but we do not intend to supersede or supplant any agreements between the Israeli or the Palestinian governments. They could agree to whatever they want, including two states, including one state, or any other formula for peace. And we are constitutionally prohibited from interfering with those agreements. We recognize the need to work with the Israeli and Palestinian governments. Our purpose is to resolve conflict and to expand the relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis in a fair and equitable manner. We believe in equal rights under the law, guaranteed human rights and freedom for all. We voluntarily give the legislator and the governments of Israel and Palestine veto power over legislation we pass relating to the domain of control of those governments. We believe in the separation of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So I just want to explain this paragraph that said we voluntarily give the legislature and the government of Israel and Palestine veto power. In other words, all the laws that we pass as a common government that have to do with the domain or control of the Israeli or the Palestinian government will be subjected to those governments having a veto power. We believe in the separation of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We believe in the creation of a permanent secular government for all the people residing in Israel and Palestine. We believe in having a separate judicial branch relating to the legislation with the Israeli and Palestinian judges with a system to avoid biased decision based on nationality. So in our last simulation with Mr. Chomsky, we had this language in the Constitution that is in the explanation of the Constitution. This is really just the explanation of the Constitution. We had this language that is in red. We recognize that the government of Israel is the legitimate government of the Israeli people, and the government of Palestine is the legitimate government of the Palestinian people. Mr. Chomsky raised an issue with regard to that paragraph. We thought about it and we removed it. So I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and go straight to Mr. Chomsky. And I understand you are muted. If you can unmute yourself, that would be great. Mr. Chomsky, you need to unmute yourself. So Dan, maybe you can unmute him. Okay, now you are unmuted. And I'd like to, first of all, thank you for coming again. We're really appreciative of that. It's very generous. And hopefully we'll have a lot more discussion this time. And we want to hear from you. First, do you have any thoughts from the last simulation until today regarding this?
I think the emendation that was made is very appropriate. And as it stands, I have no comment really on the wording. I mean, the only reservations I have are at a different level. The proposals make perfect sense, but they're at quite a distance from the objective reality. That's a problem that the Confederation can't face, but it's one that has to be kept in the back of our minds. Fact of the matter is that the Palestinian Authority is not a legitimate representative of the people in the occupied territories. Hasn't had an election for many years. It has little support. It's mostly a fiction. it's functioning primarily as a police force for Israel. The second problem, which again is beyond the reach of the Confederation to deal with, is that Israel has no intention of giving up anything. Its goal is to maintain a greater Israel in which Israel will take whatever is of value in the West Bank and will maintain Gaza as a prison and punching bag. And they're just even as we speak, they're moving more and more definitively towards achieving that objective. By now, in almost brazen contempt of not only international law, which has been for a long time, but even brazen contempt for Western liberal opinion. They're telling Western liberal opinion openly and frankly, we don't care about you. That was the meaning, the only meaning of having Benny Gantz, the supposedly liberal minister, produce the attack on the 6 Palestinian human rights and civil rights organizations. Totally fraudulent. Everyone knew it was totally fraudulent, but it was simply a gesture of contempt to American and any Western liberal opinion, saying, you don't matter, we have the force. We have the US government backing us, so we will do what we want. If we want to call Al-Haq a terrorist organization, we want to call Human Rights Watch a front for Palestinian terrorism, we'll do it. If we want to take, you can open today's issue of Haaretz and read Amira Haas on how in the last few weeks Israel has taken over huge amounts of Palestinian territory in the West Bank and turned it into Israeli farms. Completely brazen. They don't care. They'll do what they like. What are ridiculed in Israel as beautiful souls, yefei nefesh, term of ridicule. They can say what they like, but we'll do what we want. Unfortunately, that's the situation that's faced. It's beyond the reach of the Confederation, which can propose reasonable objectives. And I think the Constitution does in fact do that. But how to bridge this gap between the objectives and the reality is not clear.
Mr. Chomsky, a broader question. Israel was created 73 years ago to be a safe haven for Jews. Since 73, in the last 73 years, Israel has been involved in many, many, many wars. If we look at the number of people that have been killed on both sides, it's over 100,000 people. We have over 100, maybe 200,000 people that are severely injured. And there is constant war. Israel becomes a military power with nuclear power. The area of Israel-Palestine has never seen so much weapons in the history of humanity. Do you think that Israel achieved its goal in light of the objective evidence of war since 73 years, in the last 73 years? Did it achieve its goal of being an area in which the Jews could be protected?
First of all, I don't think that was the goal, but it may have been the rhetorical goal. But if you read Ben-Gurion speeches and so on, I think it was part of the goal. But in fact, right at the beginning, it was very clear that that was not going to happen. The establishment of Israel, the Nakba, led to the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Jews from the Arab countries, places like Morocco, where they had options. The more educated sectors went to France. They're now doctors and lawyers and so on. The less educated sectors, the poorer sectors, went to Israel, where they were a second-class population, remain so. I've seen many examples of it myself in my visits, and they're now a bitter, resentful second-class population in Israel. Iraqi Jews who were a prosperous community have been pretty much just totally destroyed. I think there's one Jew left in Iraq. This is not saving the Jewish people, it's endangering them. But Israel has obtained its objectives. After May 1948, when the flow of Czech, mainly Russian weapons came in, Israel was in a position to conquer much more of the territory than had been allotted to it under the partition agreement, and they succeeded in that. 1967, Israel did succeed in taking over what are the current occupied territories. They never succeeded in realizing the objective of Likud and a large part of the kibbutz movement, the Ichud, of taking over Jordan as well. As far as I know, Likud has never abandoned its commitment to taking over Jordan, so that wasn't achieved. But expansion was achieved. And since 1967, Israel has been involved in a systematic program almost immediately of taking over whatever was of value in the West Bank, of expanding Jerusalem. Jerusalem's now about 5 times the size of what it ever was historically, taking in many Palestinian villages annexed by Israel in violation of Security Council orders, later annexed the Golan Heights again in violation of Security Council orders, including the US, although the US basically didn't pursue it, essentially tacitly authorized it, and under Trump officially authorized it. Can talk about what happened to Gaza, it's a separate story. But Israel has accomplished these objectives. It's expanded.
What was the objective? What was the objective in creating a Jewish state?
What was the point of creating a Jewish state?
Yes.
Creating a state in which Jews would be the majority and would dictate the future of this country. I should say, as you know better than I do, that there was a strong element of the Zionist movement which was opposed to a Jewish state. When I was a teenage activist, I was greatly involved in Zionist activities. It was my main political activity. This is the 1940s. And it was mostly with groups that were opposed to a Jewish state, which was regarded then as part of the Zionist movement. By 1948, it basically was finished. But my own view is that that objective was the right one. After 48, the question became expanding state power.
Could you have a Zionist movement that does not support a Jewish state in Israel? Is that a conception? Is that a possibility to have a Zionist movement not in Israel, not for Jews?
It was a serious possibility up until 1948. As I say, I myself was very much involved in what were then called Zionist movements, dedicated to revival of Hebrew, cultural center, Arab-Jewish cooperation at that time to try to create a cooperative, basically socialist state in the former Palestine. And it was a serious movement, but it was never a majority, but it was not insubstantial. So a large part of the kibbutz movement, Shomer HaTzair, was committed to it. Other groups were committed to it. It was in my view, even in retrospect, a feasible possibility, but history went in a different direction.
I want to ask you about the United States. The United States supports for itself, for its people, for over 300 million people, equal protection. It supports separation between church and state, a secular government. It supports due process, the Constitution, the right to travel, freedom. It is against segregation. But when it comes to Israel-Palestine, the United States supports, in my view, the opposite. It doesn't support equal protection for the Palestinians. It supports a Jewish state, which is the opposite of segregation between church and separation between church and state. It does not support due process for everyone, the same for the Palestinian. Israel does not have a constitution. It does not support free travel. It does not support. So how do you reconcile that the United States has its own policies for the United States, but opposite policies for Israel-Palestine, but yet they claim that they share the same values?
Well, first of all, we should add a qualification about the United States. It may support opposed segregation in words, but throughout its entire history, it has imposed radical segregation and still does. Schools in the United States are more segregated than they were before the Supreme Court decision opposing segregation. The United States is a white supremacist society, and non-whites, blacks in particular, have been subjected to vicious oppression throughout entire US history and still today. As regards church and state, formally, the United States opposes a state religion, but there are large sectors in the United States who don't agree with that. And if the Republicans return to power, as is not unlikely, we will see, I'm sure, continued erosion of the barrier between church and state. It's already been happening under Republican auspices supported by the right-wing Supreme Court. So first of all, we should, in the United States itself, as always, we should distinguish between words and reality. In reality, the United States is a radically segregated society and remains so. Now, as far as foreign policy is concerned, it's not just Israel. The United States consistently supports reactionary, brutal regimes all over the world. Take Saudi Arabia. Probably, you can't even talk about separation of church and state. It's a joke, but or women's rights, and it doesn't exist. But that's U.S. chief ally, primary ally in the Middle East. Same is true elsewhere. India is now a close ally of the United States. Why? The Modi government in India is systematically destroying secular democracy, imposing a Hindu ethnocracy, which will, of a brutal kind, and it's a strong ally of the United States. In fact, if you're interested, I've looked in detail through what are called programs of democracy promotion in the United States. Turns out that it's constant rhetoric. Yes, we promote democracy. You look at the practice, it's almost always the opposite. Because if you support democracy in other countries, they're going to move towards independence. And no imperial power wants independence. In the Middle East, when Britain was pretty much ruling the region, it systematically supported radical Islam as opposed to secular democracy for quite good reasons. Secular Islam is more likely to keep the population quiet and under control and following British orders. Secular democracy is uncontrollable, might move in independent directions. When the US took over from Britain after the Second World War, the US pretty much displaced Britain, became the dominant imperial power, followed the same lines. In the United States, in the Middle East, the United States has pretty consistently supported radical Islam in opposition to secular democracy. In fact, that is the basis for the current US position with regard to Israel. It shifted enormously in 1967. Before 1967, the US was more or less supportive of Israel, but it was not a very close relationship. Israel was relying then mainly on France because of France's North African policies. It's getting its weapons from France. It's got its basis for its nuclear development from France. The US was sort of standoffish. In fact, in 1956, Eisenhower forced Israel out of the Sinai, just told them, look, you have to leave, and when the United States gives orders, you have to follow them, or else you're in trouble. So Israel very reluctantly withdrew. That all changed in 1967, and there was a good reason for it. There was a struggle in the Arab world in 1967 between radical Islam, based in Saudi Arabia, and secular nationalism based in Nasser's Egypt. The United States, as usual, was supporting radical Islam. Saudi Arabia and Egypt were at war, literally at war, in the Yemen at the time. Large part of the Egyptian army was there. Well, Israel administered a severe blow to secular nationalism. It essentially destroyed it in Egypt and Syria. That was a tremendous gift, first of all, to Saudi Arabia, but also to the United States. And US relations with Israel totally changed at that point. It became supportive of, strongly supportive of Israel, so as part of its general policy of supporting radical Islam against Arab secular nationalism. And that has to do with your point. What you pointed out about the United States supporting segregation, all sorts of things in Israel that it's formally opposed to, that's just imperial policy. Has nothing special to do with Israel, nothing special to do with the United States. The British did the same thing. French did the same thing in the areas of their control. That's standard imperial policy.
So the United States is not going to bring peace to Israel-Palestine?
Everyone's in favor of peace. Hitler was in favor of peace. Question is, on which terms? On what terms do you want peace? Well, the United States has, since the 1970s, in the 1970s, Israel made a fateful decision. It had the opportunity to establish a two-state settlement on the international border with all appropriate guarantees. That was explicit. It decided to reject that and in favor of expansion. At that point, they were thinking mainly of expansion into the Sinai. That was the Galilee protocols of the Golda Meir government, the labor coalition. And they made that decision that tied Israel to the United States. It meant the United States, Israel would have to rely on the United States for support as it became more of an international pariah because of its activities. And the United States backed it. Didn't have to. The United States vetoed Security Council resolutions calling for a peaceful two-state settlement on the international border. And then it continues up until the present. Some vacillation, but not very much. Under President Trump, it became extreme. I mean, now Trump said to Israel, you can do anything you want. And Biden has not changed that.
I want to shift the discussion a little bit to Israel gives Jews around the world the right to immigrate to Israel and become citizens of Israel right away under the right of return policy. My question to you is twofold. Is the right of return to Jews all over the world, and I'm focusing about the Jews all over the world, does that right of return give them safety, or does it make them more susceptible to anti-Semitism in their own country? And the second part of that same question is, does it make sense to have Jews, let's say from Moscow or from New York, immigrate to Israel, Palestine, and have a right as equal citizens, where you have Palestinians in Jerusalem and in the West Bank who were born there and lived there for generations, not have the same equality?
Does it make sense? Makes sense in terms of power politics. I mean, there's no moral basis for it. The Jews leaving from New York to live in Israel are not moving there for safety. They're much safer in New York than they are in Israel. They're moving as part of ethnocracy and a system of power and domination. You could say the same about Europe. Europe is now engaged in some of the most savage policies in history. Just look at the dead bodies in the Mediterranean. For centuries, Europe has been destroying Africa. Now people are fleeing from the wreckage of European brutality in Africa, and Europe is forcing them to die in the Mediterranean in sinking ships. Israel, in fact, the European Union is going so far as to establish major bases deep in Africa, in Niger, poorest country in the world, to try to prevent Africans from fleeing from the wreckage caused by European viciousness over centuries. Is there any justice in that? I mean, I have to agree with Pope Francis. The refugee crisis, he said, is not a refugee crisis. It's a moral crisis for the West. He's right. That's Europe, the supposedly civilized Europe. The United States is doing the same on its southern border, not far from where I live in Arizona. People are dying in the desert under brutal US policies. These are people who are fleeing from the destruction of Central America by Reagan's terrorist wars, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, devastated the societies, never recovered. Now people are fleeing from the wreckage. The United States throws children in concentration camps, drives them to die in the desert. Is there any justice in this? Was there any justice in 1924 when the United States passed its first immigration law designed to keep Jews and Italians out of the United States? That's what it was. That's why many Jews ended up in gas chambers. My extended family, for example, because the United States passed laws blocking Jews from entry into the United States. A scattered few could come in, Einstein, some others, but those laws were in effect until the 1960s. Even when Holocaust survivors, there were Holocaust survivors, were still living in concentration camps in the late 40s under conditions not very different from under the Nazis, except there were no extermination chambers. The United States refused to let them in, wanted to force them to go to Palestine. Was there anything moral about that? You don't raise the question of morality when you talk about state policy.
Yeah.
States are systems of power. Morality barely exists.
Many Jews, Israelis, and non-Jews who do not support the policies of Israel, the Israeli government, are being labeled as either anti-Semites or self-hating Jews. My question to you, Mr. Chomsky, is it possible to turn the table and argue that those who do support the policies of Israel and the Israeli government are anti-Semites and self-hating Jews?
Actually, a strong statement to that effect was made, as you know, by one of Israel's most respected figures 45 years ago, Yeshayahu Leibovitz, as close to a Gaon as Israel ever had.
Genius.
Highly respected figure.
Let me just say, Gaon in Hebrew means genius.
What?
You said Gaon, the word Gaon, right?
Leibovitz said that at the beginning of the occupation, he warned Israel that the occupation is going to turn Israeli Jews into Judeo-Nazis, his phrase. Nobody else but him could have gotten away with that. But he was so respected that he was able to say it. It would turn them into Judeo-Nazis, anti-Semites, okay? Well, unfortunately, there was a lot of truth to his remark. This idea that critics of Israel are anti-Semites goes back to Abba Eban, the respected foreign minister. He wrote an article, you can look it up, in, I think, 1972, about then, in the liberal American Jewish journal, Congress Weekly, Journal of the American Jewish Congress, in which he said that the duty of American Jews is to show that critics of Zionism, by which he meant critics of his government's policy, that critics of Zionism are either anti-Semites, if they're not Jewish, are self-hating Jews if they are Jewish. I gave two examples of self-hating Jews. One of them was I.F. Stone. The other was me. I'm proud to say we were self-hating Jews because we were critical of the policy of expansion into the territories. Well, that's Abba Eban. Notice that means 100, that covers 100% of the possibilities. Anyone who's critical of the government of Israel is an anti-Semite, according to Abba Eban's prescription, and it's the duty of American Jews to establish that. Well, that was 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And it's been followed. By now, it's a mantra. People just say it reflexively. And as you said, the opposite is more reasonable.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, practically speaking, how do we extricate the people of Israel and Palestine from this 73 years of nightmare? How do we make peace?
My own feeling is that the change basically has to come in the United States. There are changes in public opinion in the United States, significant changes. If you go back 10 or 20 years, Israel was the darling of liberal Americans. It was regarded as a flourishing social democracy. Support among liberal Democrats was overwhelming. Now that's disappeared. By now, among people who regard themselves as liberal Democrats, there's probably more support for Palestinian rights than for Israel, as Israel's moved much farther to the right. Support for Israel in the United States is among evangelical Christians who have a theology of their own kind, which is deeply anti-Semitic, but requires support for Israel, and also among the military and security sectors. They're very closely allied to Israel, and the ultra-nationalist right. So it's now the right wing of the Republican Party that's the main source of support for Israel, not liberal Democrats anymore. It's getting to the point where there are movements among liberal Democrats to question US aid to Israel. Betsy McCollum, a representative from Michigan, had introduced a resolution to cancel US military aid to Israel. That would have been unthinkable a few years ago. And I think tendency is moving in that direction, even among young Jews. Same is true among younger Jews who just can't tolerate the shift of Israel to the far right and its brutal actions, mainly in Gaza. The ones in the West Bank are kind of invisible. You don't see them, although they go on every day. But, and I think over time, this hasn't affected policy, but the United States is a moderately democratic society. You can't overlook public opinion forever. And I think there might be moves among the public in the United States to press for some sort of resolution of the conflict, at which time the ideas that you're proposing here might come into prominence. They might move from the periphery to the center of discussion. So I think it's very valuable to have them there as something, as an option to think about, which can become a live option if policy changes in the United States. That's a serious possibility, I think.
Thank you.
And the only one to think of.
Mr. Chomsky, are you willing to take some questions? We have a lot of people and they would like to ask you a question. Would that be okay? Are you open to that?
Yeah, I only have about 10 more minutes, but I have to go to another appointment. Yeah.
All right, so let's go to Nidal. You asked, and then Charles.
Hey, hello, everybody. Thank you, Joseph, for holding this great meeting. And thank you, Mr. Chomsky. I think this is the first time I hear you in person, so I feel very privileged. Thank you for being here. And I really appreciate all what you said. I have one question. It might be a little bit rough, but as you mentioned, Israel, since its inception, always tried to justify its policies in the beginning because they just want to establish a small home for the Jewish people. At every stage, they kept the expansion. And every time they have to come up with an excuse to do more and get more by creating wars or creating context to do more. And they continue to do this up to this day with too many excuses of security and protecting the Jewish people. So if you look at each single policy of these, you might buy into the Israeli narrative that, oh, they are doing this for this reason, that for that reason. But if you look at the whole project as a whole, do you think this whole project amounts to a genocide to the Palestinian people? If you take all of them together, is this something that you think there is a reasonable justification for us to think that the Zionist movement as a whole, the whole project amounts to a genocide of the Palestinian people as a nation? Thank you.
I would use I think a better term was proposed by a leading Israeli sociologist, strong supporter of the Palestinians, Baruch Kimmerling. He called it politicide, not genocide, but politicide, which I think is a more accurate term. It's destruction of the possibility of self-determination for the Palestinians. But it's not wiping them out. It's not sending them to extermination camps. It's not slaughtering them. In fact, Israel would be perfectly happy if all the Palestinians would just leave. Doesn't want to kill them off. So I think Kimmerling's term, politicide, is a more accurate one.
Okay, let's go. I'm going to read the order of people. Try to ask short questions because Mr. Chomsky's time is limited. So we have Charles, Amnon, Shiraj, and Len. Charles, please.
Mr. Chomsky, I'm wondering if you got a chance to read the letter I wrote, which elucidates what I'm about to say in a much longer fashion, but let me see if I can summarize it. And that is that I view the IPC as a soft power approach, given all the facts on the ground of basically US imperial use of Israel and Israel's own territorial desires for expansion and use of power politics in that regard. How does one counteract that when you cannot do it directly through the governmental means, and you cannot do it forcibly through a violent means, because you're at a great disadvantage if you are on the Palestinian side. So Bernie Sanders makes an example that you can drag the entire political discourse in one direction, even if you are not immediately successful. And I would see that the approach of the IPC, both when I talk to people about it in the United States, and hopefully as people come to adopt it in Israel-Palestine, could be something that changes the actual political facts on the ground by shaming basically this ongoing moral depredation that's been taking place. Do you think that's a possibility, that if there was some momentum created both within the United States and within the territories and Israel, that this is something that would force the power situation as it exists it would have to respond to it eventually?
I think it's very possible. As I said, there are significant shifts in American public opinion. There's by now talk about by serious people like Ian Lustig about how we have to move towards some kind of a single state. But I think the proposals have not been in a form which can be an authentic vision for people to strive to. The IPC proposals could fill in that gap. Could be, here's a serious, detailed vision of something that could, as best as possible, realize the legitimate, valid claims of all the people in the former Palestine. Here's a possibility. And I think if it's there, it can be the kind of vision that is grasped as a direction to move as people become more and more dissatisfied with the status quo and unwilling to accept it. This will have to be combined with pressure on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. So, for example, the decision of the Presbyterian Church to divest from anything involving the occupied territories, including US multinationals who work in the occupied territories. That's a step forward. Recently, as you know, Ben & Jerry's took the same position. They would not operate in the occupied territories. As more and more pressure is imposed on Israel to suffer costs for the occupation, I think that can be beneficial, along with provision of a vision that people could strive for as to how there could be a sensible, peaceful resolution, as public opinion in the United States and in fact in Europe shifts in the direction of opposing Israeli policies, could converge in leading to the IPC proposals as a way out of unending conflict. And things on the ground are moving in the same direction. So the Abraham Accords were hailed in the West as a great achievement. They weren't at all. They were simply another sign of Israel's drift towards alliance with the world's most reactionary states. It's already closely allied with Egypt, the most brutal dictatorship in Egypt's ugly history. This brought it into an alliance with United Arab Emirates, Bahrain under Saudi pressure, essentially integrating Israel into the most reactionary collection of states in the region. Morocco was added because Morocco has a near monopoly of phosphates, irreplaceable for agricultural production. So it's an ugly alliance, and with Benny Gantz's proclamation of that the leading human rights organizations are terrorist organizations, as I said, a brazen insult to Western liberal opinion. I think we're seeing this develop in Israel, and a related development among Western liberal opinion to say we're not going to tolerate this, that can lead to a situation where the IPC programs could offer the kind of solution that people are grasping for, but don't see. Not just let's do something about it, but here's something concrete we could do about it. So I think
Let's go to, we have Amnon next, Shiraj, Lane, and Edward Corrigan.
Thank you,
But
Mr. Chomsky.
please be cognizant that Mr. Chomsky has limited time.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. I would like to invite your attention to a few undisputed facts, and then I'll ask you my question. First of all, as you all know, Israel is the only country in the world, in the history of the world, that had to return land that was occupied, not occupied, but conquered by a war that was imposed on her. Secondly, The Palestinians, as you know, they want Israel to return to the 1967 borders, which are clearly undefensible borders, while in 1964, they had those territories within the 1967 borders. But in 1964, they established the PLO under the leadership of the arch-terrorist Arafat, and they had those territories. Now they want us to go back to the same territories that they had, but they still establish the anti-Israel terrorist organization PLO. Secondly, Israel absorbed, after 1948 war, they absorbed 800,000 Jewish refugees that had to flee Arab countries. Israel absorbed them, they settled them, and they became productive citizens, while the 600,000 Palestinian refugees that fled Israel on their own volition and under the pressure from Arab leaders to flee Israel, now they're being used as pawns by the Palestinians, and they've never been settled. They're still in poor areas, which Israel support. Israel provides them electricity, fuel, water, food, and even cement to build their building, but they build tunnels. So that's another thing that the whole world knows about it. Now, Israel, the Jewish people were sitting in this territory 2,000 years before Islam came into being, okay? And from the very first time, from the 1948, the last 73 years, everybody knows that Israel has been attacked continuously under threat of its annihilation. Every military action that Israel conducted was defensive only, to defend itself. So my question to you, sir, is twofold. Number one, how can you occupy territories that are legitimately and morally yours? How can you occupy them? It's yours. You've been there 2,000 years before Palestinians ever came into being. And there's never been any people that call Palestinian. It's just an invention of Yasser Arafat. Second question to you, sir, with all due respect to your views, which I don't agree with, what is your solution to bringing a real peace, to be fair to both sides? And I'm not saying going back to the 1967 wars, because it will be a destruction of the state of Israel. So what is your solution? What do you propose to bring a real peace to this terribly suffering region in the world, suffering by the Jewish people and by the so-called Palestinians? I don't deny that. Okay, so what do you suggest, sir? Thank you very much.
Well, I'm afraid to answer your question, I would have to go through the history that you purport to describe, which is almost exactly the opposite of the actual history. There's no time to go through it point by point, but almost everything you said is false. Talking about what happened 2,000 years ago is completely meaningless. If you want to play that game, we'll turn the United States back over to the Indians. They were here thousands of years before the European settlers came. That includes you and me. This is not a serious discussion. The fact of the matter is that let's just talk about the borders. The 1967 borders are not only defensible, but they place Israel in an overwhelming position of military superiority. Overwhelming. Israel has faced no security threat. You can you can ask the highest levels of Israeli strategic authorities, and they'll explain that to you. Israel totally overwhelms the entire Arab world in military force. So that story is just not true. The West Bank was not Palestinian, it was Jordanian. Jordan was in control of the West Bank, an ally of Israel. The PLO was formed in 1964 not to destroy Israel, but to give Palestinians a voice. If you think Arafat is a terrorist, talk about Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir, Ariel Sharon, incomparably worse terrorists, right through the period 48 to 67. These terrorists were continually attacking Palestinians, carrying out atrocities. You want to find a record of it? Look at the record of the UN observers. There's a series of them. They wrote memoirs. Each of them came in as a strong supporter of Israel. Each of them left as a sharp critic of Israel because of the atrocities that were being carried out by the Israeli authorities right from 1948 up till 1967. Then Israel had an opportunity to conquer Arab lands quickly, easily, never felt under threat, took it, and now occupy those lands and refuse and are torturing the population within them. Well, what's the solution? The solution, first, this is incidentally not my opinion. This is the opinion of virtually the entire world. Israel's the only country I know of that refuses to regard the occupied territories as occupied. That's up until Trump. Trump finally agreed with Israel. So it's Israel and Trump and you are alone in saying they're not occupied. You might want to reflect about that. They are occupied, including Gaza. Even the United States accepts that. And they're being subjected to constant torture and destruction, okay? So my solution to this is, first of all, withdraw from the illegally settled territories. Every Israeli settlement there is in strict violation of international law. Every international institution, including the Security Council and the World Court, with US affirmation, I should say, describes these as illegal. So first of all, end that, then move to a kind of a settlement in which the rights of both peoples will be recognized. And as I mentioned, I think the IPC reports a proposal is a good candidate for that. And I'm afraid I'm already over time and I will have to leave, much to my regret.
Let me just say this, Mr. Chomsky, that two Israeli prime ministers offered Arafat 96% of the land to give it back to him for peace, and he rejected it.
Nothing like that was ever done.
Mr. Chomsky, I want to thank you so much for your generosity and your willingness to come again before us. We are extremely, and I'm personally very appreciative of your time. And I thank you so much. I wish you a lot of health, and you are so bright, and I'm amazed at your instantaneous memory that you have, everything that happened so long ago. I'm very appreciative. I thank you. I'll let you go. We are going to continue.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We love you, Professor Chomsky. You're wonderful. And I remember you entertained me and my husband at MIT in your office when we spent a year at Harvard, and I called you up. My name's Sandra Shatila, and thank you
very much.
so
and
much.
I'm really sorry I have to leave.
Wonderful, Mr. Chomsky.
Thank you
so
again.
much.
Stay safe.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Keep going, keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. God bless you.
God bless you. Stay safe.
Joseph, I just want to make my one quick note in response to what Mr. Chomsky said. He said that 1967 borders are highly defensible. How can a person say such a thing where in 1967, the width of Israel at that time in the middle of the country was 9 miles, which by Air Force airplane takes 1.5 minutes to cover that distance. Number two, the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights were a continuous source of killing of Israeli farmers 700 feet below by Syrian soldiers. How can he say that these borders were defensible? No person in his right mind will say that. This is crazy. And
let me just respond on behalf of the IPC. IPC is not a solution based on land. We reject that idea that the land is the solution. We believe that the solution is people and creating a democracy for everyone, Israelis and Palestinians, based on equality. So we reject the notion that you need land to have security. We believe that you need democracy, equality, fairness to everyone in order to have a peace. But let me I'm just going to continue with the questions, because I'm sure that Shiraz and Len and Edward, they want to make a comment in regards. So Shiraz, you still want to ask your question? Shiraz, could you unmute yourself, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask Chomsky about the issue that is there any difference between American military industrial complex and Israeli industrial military complex, because I see that as a father-son relationship. And the other thing Chomsky has often said that Israel is a military base, American military base. So has that position changed vis-a-vis United States and having a different military base around the region? Thank you. Yeah, that was my.
All right, so
okay.
I'll answer on behalf of the IPC. The Israeli military base, the American military base do not give peace to Israel. The militarism, strong military, never gave peace. What the IPC could do is give peace because it doesn't have enemy anymore. It creates a situation where we live together under democracy. And when you have a democracy, when there is no enemy, there is no need for a military base. But under the Constitution, we give the Israelis and the Palestinians the option to continue to have their military base, but we think that it would not be necessary in the long run or in the future because it would create peace. Let's go to Len. Len, you have a question?
No, I don't have a question. I'm glad to see Chomsky gone because he's one of the most anti-Semitic people who are operating in the international forum right now, and he knows it, and I know it, and frankly, everybody on this panel knows it. The problem
no one else knows it. I'm sorry, I have to stop you. No one knows that. You can say your opinion. Don't speak in the
okay. I'm not interrupting you, so don't interrupt me.
Exactly. You don't speak for me either, Mr. whatever your name is. Sorry, you don't speak for me.
Don't interrupt him.
I'm not talking for you. I'm talking for myself, and I can speak for myself. And I'd appreciate if you had a little manners and allowed me to speak, and you can speak after. What I'm trying to say is what a problem you have, Joseph, and I was going to ask Chomsky this question. Every single person, every single comment, including those made by you, Joseph, are anti-Israel and pro-Arab and almost indiscriminately. The only one in this entire group and the only comment that made a positive statement about the Jews and Israel is Amnon. And Chomsky, of course, actually will reflect on what you're saying. First of all, Israel did not get invented in 1948. Israel was a product of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire fell, and the French and the British and the other allies divided up what was the Ottoman Empire. The British mandate for Palestine was only one of the mandates. There were other ones for Syria and Lebanon, etc. That's where it started. It was ratified by the League of Nations in 1920, in 1922, 1920.
In San Remo.
San Remo, that's when Palestine, which became Israel, was established. It was ratified, and it was ratified by Article 80 of the UN Charter, which states clearly, and every member of the United Nations, when they sign that UN nations, and that's half the countries in the world, have to abide by those statements. And Article 80 says that what was promised to the Jews cannot be taken away. So the United Nations and Chomsky and the UN Security Council can make all the resolutions they want against the Jews. But the fact is, under international law, Israel includes what's now called the disputed territories, or Judea and Samaria, and Gaza, until such time as Israel is willing to give some away. And Amnon was right that the Palestinians were given chances to have their own country, and they refused every time. Their basic goal has been since the beginning was the elimination of all infidels in the Middle East. You talk about the Nakba. What was the Nakba? The Nakba was the Arabs, and primarily the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, his attempt to continue with the Holocaust and slaughter the Jews of the Middle East. He failed, and part of that was that a bunch of his own people got exiled. And the same way, Amnon points out all the Jews that came from the Arab world, they didn't come there because they didn't like where they were living. They came there because they were pushed out by radical Islam. And most of the people of Israel are descendants of Mizrahi Jews, or Jews from the Middle East. So they're not a bunch of white guys, which Chomsky obviously hates. They're mostly Middle East brown people, and there was a million things he said, and he also called Jordan Israel's ally. If Jordan was Israel's ally, why did it kill or ethnically cleanse every single Jew that was caught up in the areas that they conquered in 1948 and 49? So they were not allies. They were their enemies. And Israel has no claims on Jordan, and he makes that statement, and he's lying because he's a propagandist. Now, I could say a lot more, but I'll let other people talk. Thank you.
Yeah, Lynn, let me respond to what you said about me. I agree. I am not supportive of the Israeli government. I am, because look at the facts.
Looking at the facts.
Yeah, I didn't interrupt you. You're okay. Talking about 73 years of constant wars.
Yes.
You have 73 years with hundreds of thousands of people being killed and injured. Israel, just look at the facts. Israel did not give safety and security to the Jews. That's you cannot controvert that fact. There are Israeli people and Palestinians and Egyptians and Syrians that are in their grave now since the last 73 years. And it's not over. It's not like, okay, now everything is, it's the beginning. We are now talking about nuclear annihilation, nuclear war. So, Len, if you have a plumber coming to your house for 73 years to fix the shower and it not being fixed, you would say, well, that plumber is not good. We need to change the plumber. I am not anti-Israel. Most of my family lives in Israel. I served in the Israeli military. I am in favor of peace. And what I am saying is that the Israeli government, throughout its existence, never gave peace. So if they had the dignity and the honor, if they claim that they want peace, they would say, okay, we failed, let's look for another solution. But they don't say that. What they say is, we need to defeat the other enemy, and we need to be stronger militarily. We need to have more weapons. We need to have submarines with nuclear weapons. Israel is, if you can, it's 9 million people. It's smaller than the Los Angeles County. Los Angeles County does not have nuclear weapons, does not have nuclear submarines.
Can I answer you? You've got 1.5 billion Muslims. Probably at least a quarter of them are absolute radical Islamists who will kill every Jew in the world. Hamas's charter, which comes straight out of the Quran, says that every Jew in the world is to be killed, including you, Joseph, including you. Let me finish. Including you and your Israeli relatives. The fact that there is not peace in that region, do not blame that on Israel. Don't blame that on Israel. And why Israel has to be strong is because it's surrounded by enemies. It's surrounded by people that won't accept infidels in the Middle East. They cleared them out of everything, everywhere else. They cleaned the Christians out of Lebanon. And you're blaming Israel. I'm not blaming Israel. I'm blaming the
Look, regardless.
Why are you blaming Israel? Why don't you pick on anybody else? Because the Jews are always the victim when people don't like things.
I am of Israeli descent.
It's fine.
I speak Hebrew. My family is in there, and I am entitled to ask questions about peace. The fact that there are other countries who want wars doesn't, if there are people jumping off the roof, it doesn't mean you want to jump off the roof too.
There are 26,000 Israelis that have been killed because of Arab wars of aggression and genocide against it. Right. So the answer isn't to kill the rest of the Jews. The answer is to force the Arabs to make peace. And the Palestinians.
So what you are telling me, Lynn, and we're going to end it in that.
Okay.
Is that Israel has no ability to make peace.
No, Israel has not got the ability to make peace with people that want to kill them.
Right, and I am saying there is a way to make peace with the Palestinians, and that's to create a democracy. If you claim, let's go to the next person, Edward.
Can I say something here, please?
Well, you need to raise your hand. There is a
I did, sorry.
Okay, so I'm sorry. Are you the person in 614 area code?
Yes, my name is Suha Amer. I'm from California.
Yeah, okay, so you are after Edward.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Sure. Edward, please.
Edward, yes. It's unfortunate that NOAM or Professor Chomsky has gone. Len and Non are basically have absorbed the Zionist propaganda and Hasbara. They make wild statements which, quite frankly, are factually not true. One example is they talk about all these Muslims wanting to exterminate Jews. There are 20,000 Jews in Iran. There are Jews still in the West Bank that live as Palestinians. Wild statements which are factually not correct, okay? And so they're it's a minority, but there were Jews that lived in, there was actually 9 Jews that were slaughtered in the Sabra Shatila massacre in Lebanon. And it was the PLO that guarded the synagogues in Beirut. And it was the Israelis that destroyed the synagogue there. So, you need to have facts basis. And the article about the Palestinian Jews is actually from the Jerusalem Post. You may have heard of that paper. But anyways, to move this forward and not deal with mythology and sort of, throwing dirt at each other, there's been some recent changes. Biden, for example, they abstained recently at the Security Council resolution about Palestinians and being entitled to self-determination. And Biden also is proposing to build a consulate in Jerusalem for the Palestinians. So, and you have Bernie Sanders, you've got the Squad, you have a small minority within the Democratic Party that seem to be willing to shift their positions on this. And I'm just wondering, are these cracks, how can we make these cracks bigger? How can we get people to stop talking about mythology and false history, but deal with the realities of today and the fact that Palestinians, if they ask for equal rights in Israel, they get thrown in jail?
All right, let's go to Suha.
Yes, hi. My name is Suha Amer. Hi, I enjoyed it very well with Professor Chomsky. I think he is one of a kind to this mankind. And thank you so much for continually, bringing him on. So I'm going to comment on, I don't know, the two persons that were, talking against.
Lynn and Amnon.
Yes, hi. I am Lebanese in origin, and I was 8 years old when Israel invaded my country, and I lost loved ones in that invasion. And up till now, I still don't get clear answers as to why they did that. And I'm a journalist, basically. I wanted to find answers, and going back to 2,000 years ago in history and claiming that land that it was yours. Well, if you want to play your rhetoric, the Canaanites were before you 4,000 years ago in that land. And genome results from Harvard University and other universities in Europe shows that 94% of the current Lebanese people are direct descents from the Canaanites. So how would you like it if those Lebanese people go to international court and say, hey, we demand our land back and we want to kick you out from there? Would you give us back that land? That's my question. Also, I feel like you guys, what do you want? Why are you in this forum? Are you with peace? That's my question. Do you have, what is the percentage you have in your mind to do? What is your outlook to the future concerning the Palestinian and Israeli conflict? You guys have been at each other's throats for decades. So what do you want to do? Continue with that? Or do you want to sit down and talk logic here? Because there are lots of people that I know that love to live in peace from both spectrums, like from the Israelis and the Palestinians, especially the youth. Are you going to give them a chance at peace? Or do you want to have fights all over the world now? That's my question. And thank you so much for having me on. Thank you.
Yeah, and let me just reply. Soha, I don't know if you were present at the beginning or you saw our constitution.
Yes, I did. Yeah, I was here.
Okay, so I'm perplexed by your question. What do you want?
My question is not for you or I'm answering the two guys that were attacking Chomsky, and labeling him. Yeah.
All right. Let's go to Zohar.
Joseph, let me just respond to Suha.
No, let's go to Zohar. He's been waiting.
But I would like later on to respond to her because she referred to me.
Okay, then
in all fairness.
A quick reply, and then we need to conclude because
okay,
I also have to go. Okay, yeah, Zohar, please.
I'll make it quick. Zohar.
No. Let's go to Zohar. And then.
Oh,
and then-
Zohar, okay.
It's
go
fine,
ahead.
it's fine. Amnon, you can give a response if you want. I don't want to, if you feel it's
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll make it very quick. Suha, first of all, salam alaikum. I appreciate your
Ahlan.
yeah, I appreciate your opinion. Thank you very much. I just want to let you know, you ask how come the Israelis invaded Lebanon. I'm sure you know the history that the northern part of Israel, the Upper Galilee, was under severe continuous attack by Lebanese Katyushas that killed Israeli people in the Israeli towns along the border. Syrian and Lebanese terrorists came into Israel, killed 31 Israeli children in a school in a town called Ma'alot. It was continuous terrorism. Israel went into Lebanon in order to eradicate the terrorist activity.
Wrong.
That was it. And one more thing regarding the notions of giving land for peace. A lot of people think that if Israel gives land, they'll get peace. It never happened before, but here, Israel not only give lands, they give peace for peace. So look at Egypt. Israel gave Egypt peace. Israelis don't shoot at Egypt anymore, while Egypt don't shoot at Israel anymore. But in addition to giving peace to Egypt, Israel gave in the entire Sinai with all the oil wells and everything, that it's 3 times the size of Israel, gave it to Egypt. So the notion of giving land for peace is ridiculous. You give peace for peace, and then in addition to that, Israel gave more by the land. You understand? It's so, but Israel is willing to do that. That's my point. But giving back all these things, going back to the 1967 borders, it would be a national suicide, and no Israeli government can agree to that. Okay, so thank you. I yield back.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Zohar.
Hi. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you very much for organizing this again. And thank you for bringing on Professor Chomsky. Len, if you're still here, I wanted to apologize for cutting you off. It was just, I just wanted to make it clear that your view is not shared by everyone else on this platform, and presenting it this way is not accurate. So just to clarify again, I am Jewish Israeli. I grew up in Israel. I served in the Israeli military. I too was acquainted with Professor Chomsky by viewing his interviews on Israeli media, where he was presented as a radical leftist and a Jewish self-hating Jew, or all the words that you use to describe him now. Whatever it is, I know where this view is coming from. I understand some of the fears and the narrative that comes from Amnon's mouth as well. I know this narrative because I grew into it. I'm sorry to say, first of all, I'm happy to say I no longer hold these views. I got to expand the sources from which I gain my historical narrative. And I'm sorry to say that there are still many people who hold these views who clearly did not experience the same kind of events that I did, that got them to participate or to have the motivation to participate in such events to build a better future for the rest of us. Now, I'm trying to say is that if we are motivated to build a better future for both Israelis and Palestinians, if we want to stop this circle of bloodshed that has been forcing our kids to die needlessly and carry out guns in the very early age, we really need to move past our phobia and talking about the past and thinking about all the people who want to kill us all the time and how there could never be peace with these people or with those people. I traveled and I met loads of people, Palestinians and Lebanese and Jordanian and Egyptians. None of them wanted to kill me when they heard I was Israeli. We had a nice one-on-one conversation that you can have with just about anyone around the world. If we keep on generalizing everyone because they have this passport or because their leader said this thing in 1956 or in 1972, we're not really managed to cross over this bridge that we need to in order to save ourselves from any further harm. Thank you.
Zor, toda rabba lecha for me, of course. And I agree with your notion that says we need to move forward to get peace. I'm totally in agreement on that. The question is, how do we do it to be fair to both sides, to Israel and Palestinians? Palestinians deserve peace as well. You know, I have quite a few friends who are Arabs and Palestinians, and we're good friends. The people of Palestine, they want peace. It's the leaders that are opposing and promoting all kind of political agenda. But I agree with you. We want peace, and I'm sure
That's
you
your
do the
opinion.
same.
All right, I want to give some concluding remarks. It is possible to have a common government. I want you to look at this website with the country of Estonia. They handle their elections online. They've been doing this now for several years, I think 20 years. I'm not sure about that 20 years number, but it's been a long time. 44% of their public vote online, and 99% of the public services by the government is provided online, and they save 844 years of time by having a government online. They have they provide identity, e-identity. You can vote by e-identity, so you can identify who are the people living there in Israel and Palestine, and give them the right to vote and the ability to vote. So in order to do that, we will need grassroots financial support. We got a very large donation to the IPC, and it was an anonymous donation, and I want to thank that person. He knows who he is, and it helps us continue to go on. We need to educate and recruit candidates for the parliament, and we need to share this vision on social media. We're not here to argue who is right and who is wrong. We are here, like Zora said, to create a possible future for all of us, the Israelis and the Palestinians together. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop sharing. And I want to thank all of you for participating. I see you still have your hands up. Is this Len and Suha? Len,
Yes.
you want? Yeah, go ahead, Len.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to say that I like your idea, Joseph, of having an override group and all of this. When you talk about somebody in Europe, he doesn't have Iran, which is threatening to nuke his country. So it's a lot easier when you're in the middle of no place. And as for Suha, you asked what I think we should do. I think we need 2 states, one for the Arabs and one for the Israelis. I think they do. I think there's far too much hostility forever to be a one-state solution. So I'd like to see 2 states, and I'd see where everybody can build whatever they want to on their side of the border. Certainly any state that Israel gives, and Israel is giving under international law, whether anybody likes it or not, to give land to the Palestinian Authority or whatever group they are, they cannot be allowed to threaten Israel's existence. So there would have to be somewhat demilitarized. And you ask why Israel went into the PLO went into Lebanon, started a civil war, drove out 700,000 Christians, and Israel was actually invited in to make peace.
Okay, Suha, do you want to say last words?
I'm not
Sorry,
gonna,
Joseph,
yeah, I
Oh,
reserve my
sorry. I
answer
want to
to both
interrupt.
Amnon, and I reserve my answers to Amnon and to Mr. I don't know what, sorry, the name
Len.
of the last.
Len.
Read my butt.
Yeah, Glenn, okay, I reserve my answers because I respect the time, and hopefully I'll get the chance to respond to both of you with, I just wish that we really get to make true peace in that region, because I think the future generations, we owe it to them. And, you know, they really need to live in peace. We screwed it big time over there. So I wish you all peace. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And
I agree.
Can I say
we'll see you
something?
the next.
Joseph, can I say something?
Sure.
I think it's, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm being very rude and I'm interrupting. I think
No.
Israel needs more Israelis like Zohar. So
That's
I
true.
would like to clone Zohar. I would like, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Zohars.
Yes,
Okay,
that's
bravo
true. I agree
Zohar.
with you. I
Bravissimo
agree with you.
Zohar. And
All right.
stay well
Thank
and
you.
stay healthy and best greetings.
Thank you so much. And we'll see you in the next simulation. Next time is going to be a simulation. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joseph.
Bye.
Stay well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.